Chapter 131, please. The cozy wooden, glass house nestled in the mountain's snowy landscape. The house, with its warm brown hue, stood out against the pale moon. Inside the cozy house, the mouth-watering aroma of steak sizzling on a grill lured Mia away from her deep sleep. Dimly aware that the huge bed on which she slept was too big to be her own bed at home, she opened her eyes and rolled onto her back, completely confused and lost, as she was met with an alarming darkness. Blinking in the inky darkness of the unfamiliar room, she turned her face the opposite direction, searching for the pale source of illumination spilling through what turned out to be a narrow parting of the draperies on the wall. Moonlight, she realized, with her forehead creased into a frown. For a few blissful moments, she thought she was in a luxuriously large hotel room somewhere, on vacation. Did she finally decide to go on the holiday vacation Rain had suggested months ago? She wondered, recalling Rain had once spoken about a cozy vacation island. Mia glanced at the digital clock on the nightstand. Wherever she was, the local time was 9:10 p.m. and it was chilly in the room, the kind of deep chill that made her sleepily realize she wasn't in Mirage Mesa, nor in Zen. It hit her then that hotel rooms were never fragrant with the aroma of cooking food. She was in a house somewhere, not a hotel, and there were footsteps in the next room, close to hers. Heavy, masculine footsteps. Awareness hit her like a punch in the stomach, and she sat bolt upright in bed, already throwing the covers off and standing up in a haste, hitting her toe against the nightstand in the process. Ouch! She cried out in pain while limply walking towards the one-sided glass wall in the room, her mind working quickly to process everything that had happened and how she'd ended up in here. Outside the glass wall, all she could see was snow and dark mountains in the distance, along with the distant echo of wolves. Goosebumps lifted on her bare legs, and she looked down in shivering disbelief at what she was wearing, a man's t-shirt. Mia had started to panic when everything began to make sense. She'd taken a shower. Having nothing to wear, she'd grabbed any random clothes from a dresser drawer and wore it. Neil's warning came back to her, along with the realization that she wasn't on a vacation. There are no other houses on this mountain except this one. I have your car keys, so your only means of leaving would be on foot, but you'd freeze to death long before reaching the highway. Relax, Mia told herself aloud, but she was rested now and fully alert, and her mind was tumbling over itself with possible escape solutions, none of which were even remotely possible. On top of that, she was starving. Food first, she decided, then she'd try to think of a way out of here. From her suitcase, she pulled out a blue jogger pant, as it was the only casual attire she had in her suitcase. Everything else was formal attire because she hadn't planned on staying in Novaria for long. She'd washed out her underwear after her shower, but it was still soaking wet. Pulling on her jogger pants, she went into the large walk-in closet and looked at the heavy men's sweaters neatly folded on the shelves, longing for something clean and cozy to wear. She took out a bulky black knitted sweater and held it up to herself. It hung down to her knees. Deciding with a shrug that she didn't care how she looked, and the thick sweater would hide the fact that she wasn't wearing a bra, she put it on. She'd washed her hair and blown it dry before she went to bed, so there was nothing to do but brush it. Automatically, she bent over, brushing her back-length hair and styled it just as she always did whenever she was at home, finding an odd comfort in following this one small, familiar routine. Finished, she straightened up, gave her hair a few more brush strokes, then brushed it back off her forehead, letting it fall into natural waves at the sides. She reached for her purse to put on lip gloss, then she changed her mind. Looking nice for an escaped convict was not only completely unnecessary, but probably a major mistake, considering that kiss in the snow she'd participated in at dawn this morning. That kiss. It seemed like weeks in her mind, not merely hours since he'd kissed her, and now that she was well rested and alert, Mia felt reasonably sure his only interest in her was to ensure his safety and nothing else. Nothing sexual. Definitely nothing sexual. Please, heaven, not sexual. She glanced at the mirrors on the bathroom walls and felt reassured. For the past years, she'd always been too busy and preoccupied with her work to worry much about her appearance lately. Whenever she took time to study her face, she always felt she had a rather odd face filled with startling features that were too prominent for an adult woman's good, like her eyes and chin and that absurd dent in her cheeks that deepened whenever she smiled or ate. Now, however, she was somehow thrilled with her looks. In a jogger pants and an oversized sweater, with her hair like this and no makeup on, she wouldn't appeal sexually to any man. She would appear boring and plain to them, particularly one who'd no doubt been to bed with hundreds of gorgeous, glamorous women in the past. He was the infamous Neil Wayner. Women must have begged to warm his bed. He had, no doubt, only put up a show when he took the disguise of a professor in the past. His interest in her would definitely not be sexual if he were to see her in such boring attire, Mia decided with absolute confidence. Drawing in a long, steadying breath, she reached for the door handle and turned it, reluctant but ready to face her kidnapper, and hopefully a delicious meal, that was, if he knew how to cook. The bedroom door wasn't locked, Mia realized as she turned the doorknob and it opened. She distinctly remembered locking the door when she went to bed. Did he creep in on her when she was asleep? Silently, she opened the door and stepped down the stairs into the main room of the house. For a split second, the inviting beauty of the scene she met made her feel completely confused and astonished. A fire was roaring in the fireplace, the lights on the chandelier high above were dimmed, and candles were lit on the coffee table, flickering on the crystal wine glasses he'd probably set out beside a thick rug. It might have been the wine glasses and candles that suddenly made Mia feel as if she was walking into a seduction scene, or perhaps it was the dimmed lights or the soft music playing on the voice-activated speakers. Trying to inject a firm, businesslike tone into her voice, she headed toward Neil Wayner, who was standing in the kitchen, his back to her, taking something out of the oven. "Are we expecting any guests?" she asked. He turned and looked at her, an unexplainable, lazy smile sweeping over his face as he surveyed her from head to foot. Mia had the staggering, and impossible, impression that he actually liked what he saw, an impression that was confirmed by the way he lifted his wine glass to her in the gesture of a toast and said, "Somehow, you look adorable in my sweater." Suddenly realizing that after 5 years in prison, any woman would probably appeal to him, Mia took a cautious step backward to avoid his gaze. "The last thing I want to do is look nice for you. In fact, I'd rather wear my own clothes, even if they're not suitable for a house attire," she said, turning on her heels, heading back upstairs. "Mia," he snapped, all the amusement gone from his voice. Mia stopped, turned around, amazed and alarmed by the dangerous swiftness of his mood swings. He was unpredictable and very temperamental, to the point it always sent cold shivers down her spine. She took another cautious step backward as he began to advance toward her, a wine glass in each of his hands. "Have something to drink," he ordered, pushing a long-stemmed glass toward her. Mia glanced at the glass but made no attempt in taking it. "Take it, damn it." He made a visible effort to soften his tone. "It'll help you relax." "Why should I relax?" she countered stubbornly. Despite the stubborn lift of her chin and her rebellious tone, there was a tiny quaver of fear in her voice, and when Neil heard it, his annoyance with her disappeared immediately. She'd shown so much courage during the last 24 hours, she'd fought him so relentlessly that he'd actually believed she wasn't very frightened most of the time. Now, however, as he looked at her upturned face, he saw that the trouble he'd put her through had left faint dark smudges beneath her glorious eyes, and her smooth skin was abnormally pale. She was amazing, he thought, courageous, kind, and brave as hell. Perhaps if he didn't like her, genuinely like her, it wouldn't have mattered to him that she was watching him as if he were a dangerous animal. The thought that she viewed him as a monster seemed to hurt him more than the fact that the world viewed him that way. He'd realized that he liked her before he was sent to prison, and he knew she liked him, too, then. But now, wisely suppressing the urge to put his hand against her cheek and try to reassure her, which would undoubtedly panic her, or to offer an apology for kidnapping her, which she'd definitely find hypocritical, he did something he'd promised himself he'd never bother to do again. He tried to convince her of his innocence. "A moment ago, I asked you to relax, and," he began, but she interrupted him. "You ordered me to relax, you didn't ask." Her firm reprimand brought a reluctant smile to his lips. "Now I am asking." Thrown completely off balance by what sounded like gentleness in his voice, Mia took the glass from him and took a sip of her wine, stalling for time, steadying her confused senses, while he stood only 2 feet away, towering over her, his broad shoulders blocking out her view of anything but him. It was then that she realized he'd evidently showered, shaved, and changed clothes while she slept. And that, in a pair of charcoal trousers and a black sweater, Neil Wayner looked no different from how she remembered. He was far more handsome than the faint memories of him she had in her mind. His gray eyes were as beautiful, mesmerizing as they were in the past. As she was regarding him with what looked like captivated eyes, he lifted his hand and braced it against the wall beside her shoulder, and when he spoke again, his deep voice had that same strange, compellingly gentle quality. On the way here, you asked me if I was innocent of the crime I was sent to prison for, and I gave you a flippant answer the first time and a grudging answer the next. Now I'm going to tell you the truth simply and voluntarily. Mia tore her gaze from his face and stared into the ruby wine in her glass, suddenly afraid that in her state of weak weariness, she might actually believe the lies she sensed he was about to tell her. "Look at me, Mia," he whispered softly. With a mixture of dread and helpless anticipation, she lifted her eyes and met his steady silver gaze. "I didn't kill or plot to kill your mom or anyone else. Nor did I purposely allow the bomb to explode in that mall years ago. I was framed by someone and sent to prison for the crimes I didn't commit. I'd like you to at least believe there's a possibility I'm telling you the truth." Uncertainly, she stared into his silver eyes, but in her mind she suddenly saw the scene of her mother's lifeless body laying in the pool of her blood. However, the scene was quick to change to the one in the frozen river. Instead of insisting she drive across the river with him, he had let her get out of the car, and then he had given her blankets to keep warm in case the ice collapsed, in case he drowned when the car plunged into that deep, icy river. She remembered the harsh desperation in his voice when he kissed her in the snow, pleading with her to go along with the ploy so the truck driver wouldn't be hurt. He'd had a gun in his pocket, but he'd not attempted to use it. And then she remembered his kiss, that urgent, hard kiss that had gentled suddenly and then become soft and insistent and sensual. Since dawn that morning, she'd been forcibly trying to forget the memory of that kiss, but now it came back, vibrant and alive and dangerously exciting. Those recollections combined seductively with the rich timbre of his deep voice as he added, "This is the first normal night I've had in over 5 years. If the military are close behind on my trail, it will be my last one. I'd like to enjoy it if you'll cooperate. Please." Chapter 132 Wild in Bed. Mia was suddenly inclined to cooperate with him. For one thing, despite her nap, she was mentally exhausted and not up to sparring with him. She was also starving and heartily sick of being afraid. But the memory of that kiss had nothing to do with her surrender. Nothing whatsoever, she told herself. Nor did it have anything to do with the sudden, impossible conviction she had that he was telling her the truth. "I'm innocent of those crimes," he repeated more forcefully, his gaze never leaving hers. The words hit her with a jolt, yet still she resisted, trying not to let her foolish emotions overrule her intellect. All the investigation and evidence led to him, he had killed them. "If you can't actually believe that," he said with a harsh sigh, "could you at least pretend you believe it and cooperate with me tonight?" Stifling the urge to nod, Mia said cautiously, "What sort of cooperation do you have in mind?" "Conversation," he said. "Light-hearted conversation with you. So is decent food, a fireplace, moonlight in the windows, and the sight of a pretty woman." A definite note of encouragement lightened his voice as he added, "I'll do all the cooking if you'll agree to the arrangement." Mia hesitated, stunned by his reference to her as a pretty woman. Then she decided he had meant nothing by it except a little empty flattery. A night without tension and fear was being offered to her, and her battered nerves cried out for relief. What harm was there in what he asked, particularly if he were truly innocent? As long as he meant nothing sexual, she had nothing to lose. "You'll do all the cooking," she bargained. He nodded, a lazy grin sweeping over his handsome face as he realized she was about to agree, and the unexpected glamour of that white smile of his did treacherous things to her heart rate. "Okay," she agreed, smiling a little despite her desire to remain at least partially aloof, "but only if you'll do the cleaning up as well as the cooking." Neil, who in the past would never have agreed to something as absurd as cooking and cleaning himself, chuckled at that. "You drive a hard bargain, but I accept. Sit down while I finish the dinner for us," he said as he turned back to the oven. Mia obeyed and sat down on one of the stools at the counter that divided the kitchen from the living room. "Tell me about how your life has been for the past years," he said, taking a baked potato out of the oven. Mia took another swallow of the wine he'd given her for courage so she wouldn't feel all those bitter emotions that came with recollecting her life from the past years without her mother. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "General things, for a start," Neil said casually. "When are you getting married to your fiancée?" The thought of her marriage hadn't yet sat well with him, but he fought back anything that would lead to disagreement to have a peaceful night. "Owen and I are still talking about it," she said. What is there to discuss when you are already engaged? Or is it that you aren't sure about Owen yet? Mia choked on her wine. Stifling an embarrassed laugh, she said, I don't actually think that question falls in the category of general information. And FYI, his name is Owen, not Owner. I'll keep that in mind next time, he agreed with a small grin. So, what's holding up the marriage? To her disgust, Mia felt herself blush beneath his amused gaze. She was the one holding up the marriage, even though Owen had wanted it to happen in a flash, but she wasn't going to tell him that because she didn't want to be asked why. She replied to him with admirable calmness, we want to be certain the time is right, and we are not rushing things. Sounds to me like you're stalling. Do you live with him in the same house? He asked curiously. Absolutely not, Mia said hurriedly before she could stop herself, and he lifted his brows as if he found her pleasingly amusing. So you live alone or with other family members? Mia's eyes dulled at that question. Her life for the past years would be considered boring and lonely without any family members. She'd lived a redundant life and focused it only on her career. I live alone, she replied, hiding her bitter expression behind the wine glass. Not yet married and no family members, he said, as he poured more wine in her glass. So no one is looking for you now, wondering where you are? He asked, feeling immensely pleased that she lived alone and not with Owen. I'm sure a lot of people are. Who, for instance? My fiancé, for a start. By now he'd undoubtedly be frantic and calling people to see if anyone's heard from me. The first person he'd call is my best friend, Rain. Owen has a deep connection in the business world, he won't stop until he finds me. She said, pleased to see that he looked a bit concerned by that information as his expression had turned grim. By now, she believed Owen must have gathered his team to search for her, not to mention if the media hears of her kidnapping, her fans would come after Neil Wayner's head. The brief feeling of power Mia felt at seeing him alarmed was even headier than the wine she was drinking. Nodding happily, she continued to say, Owen's men everywhere will be hunting you down with dogs and guns, and the citizens of our country will be praying they find you right away. Turning slightly aside, Neil poured the last of the bottle of wine into his glass and tossed it down. Great, let them come, he said with a grim expression, all humor gone from his face. The mood of friendly conversation had been such a relief that Mia soon regretted its loss when she saw how grim he looked, and she searched for something to say that might restore his good mood. What are we having for dinner? She asked finally. The question shook him from his grim mood, and he turned to the pot on fire. Something simple, he said. I'm not much of a cook, so don't expect anything good. With his body blocking her view of the cooking, she had little to occupy her, and so Mia idly watched the way his sweater stretched across his wide shoulders. He was amazingly muscular, as if he'd been working out in the prison gym. Prison. She'd read somewhere that many people who are sent to prison are actually innocent, and she found herself suddenly clinging to the comforting hope that Neil might actually have been one of them. Deep within her heart, she longed to believe in his innocence. She despised the guilt that consumed her whenever she smiled at him instead of condemning him for his crime. She wished for him to be innocent so that she wouldn't have to bear the burden of guilt, so that she wouldn't feel remorseful as she sat there waiting for him to finish cooking so they could share a meal together like normal. Without turning, he said, sit down on the sofa. I'll bring the food over there for us. Mia nodded and got off the stool, noting that the second glass of wine was definitely affecting her, making her feel a little too relaxed and lightheaded. With Neil following her, carrying plates, she went over to the sofa and sat down at one of the smooth, soft cushions he'd laid in front of the fireplace. He put down 2 plates, one of which contained a juicy steak and baked potato. But in front of her, he plopped down a plate on which he had turned a can of tuna fish. That was all. No vegetable, no garnish, nothing. He didn't give her the juicy steak nor the potato, just the tuna fish, which she'd intended to use for a sandwich in the evening but had changed her mind when he told her to make for both of them. After having her mouth water for so long in anticipation of a thick, juicy, sizzling steak, he had deprived her of it and gave her this stupid tuna fish. Mia's reaction to the cold, round mound of boring, unappetizing tuna fish was swift and unguarded. Her irate gaze snapped to his face, her mouth open in angry dismay, but no word came out of it. Isn't that what you wanted? I saw you reaching for it in the evening like a sneak thief, he remarked innocently, ignoring her irate glares. Or would you prefer a nice steak like the one I left for you in the kitchen, M.I.A. more? There was something about his boyish prank, something about his engaging grin and his mesmerizing, smiling eyes that caused an unexpected, and, under the circumstances, bizarre reaction from Mia. She started to giggle, and then she started to laugh. She laughed so hard tears were streaming down her eyes. She couldn't even get up to go and get the steak he'd spoke of in the kitchen, but he got up and walked back to get it for her. Her shoulders were still shaking with laughter when he walked back to the sofa carrying another plate with the steak on it and put it in front of her. "Like this one a little better?" he asked with a smile. "Well," she said, trying to sound serious despite the laughter still shimmering in her eyes, "I can forgive you for kidnapping and terrifying me, but it's a hanging offense to give me tuna while you eat steak. I could be a beast when it comes to food." Mia would have been content to eat in peaceful silence, but as she cut the first bite of steak, he noticed for the first time that she had a bandage around her left wrist and asked her how she'd gotten injured. "Oh, it's an injury I got weeks ago before I traveled to Novaria," she explained, looking down at her wrist with a softened expression. Noticing the tenderness in her eyes as she stared down at her injured wrist, Neil took it that her fiancé must have had something to do with the injury. She must have gotten it when they were making love in an intense way, or else there was no way one would look so happy at the thought of a wound if it weren't inflicted through something passionate. "Was he that wild with you in bed?" he asked, swallowing down the unexplainable emotions that rose to his throat. "Excuse me?" She looked taken aback. "What is wild?" Chapter 133 Reflecting on Life. "Your wrist, did he do that?" he began to explain, but she interrupted him with a small laugh. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I got injured a week ago in a ceremony at the orphanage." "What?" Noticing his surprise and seeing how obviously he seemed to crave conversation with her, she smiled and began to explain to him while she ate. "Owen and I were invited to a charity event at an orphanage in Zen weeks ago. But when we got there, Owen had to leave for some important meeting while Rain and her boyfriend, Max, stayed back with me. Actually, before I was invited, I had been feeling quite down. Then, when I saw the children at the orphanage, I couldn't help myself anymore and got too excited with them. At first, I felt so bad for visiting the orphanage without buying enough gifts for the children. Then I decided to rent a big bus and took the children out to the amusement park in the city. We went to the haunted house, and one of the children got so scared he jumped on me all of a sudden, and I lost my balance and ended up cutting my wrist on some sharp object. It was my own fault, the little boy was so terrified." She finished, smiling at the memory. "I love all the children and wish I could take them back home with me. And at that moment, the thought of adopting one of them seemed so right, but then I changed my mind." "Why did you change your mind?" She waved her fork dismissively. "I changed my mind because the children look so happy together. If I adopt one of them, when I know I won't have time for the child because of my work, I'll feel terrible. Besides, Owen won't approve of adoption when he looks eager to have his own children. But I do plan on taking full responsibility for some of the kids at the orphanage by giving them the education they deserve. Even though I didn't end up adopting any of them, I still consider them as a part of me somehow." Neil noted the softness that crept into her voice and the glow that lit her brown eyes as she spoke of the children, and he continued to smile at her, marveling at her capacity for compassion and her sheer sweetness. She liked children, he noted. A surge of bitterness crept into his heart with the realization that she would be married to a man who was as eager as she was to have children. Unwilling to let her stop talking, he cast around for another subject and asked, "What were you doing in Novaria the day we met?" "Oh, that. I actually traveled to Novaria because I was so eager to interview Aurora Quinn, the most talked about celebrity in the country." "Did you interview her?" he asked. "Yes, I did. It was a fun interview. Do you like your job?" he asked, strangely unwilling to let her stop talking. He'd chosen the right topic, Neil realized, when she gave him a heart-stopping smile and warmed to the subject immediately. "Of course, I do." And so she continued to tell him everything she liked about her job and how much it meant to her. She told him how people had disliked her at first because of the scandal 5 years ago about her being the reason Neil Weiner had killed those students. Noticing that their current conversation was destroying the lively atmosphere, Neil asked her another question to divert the conversation. "Do you still play the guitar?" "I stopped playing the guitar the day I left Zen, but I was forced to play it again months ago," she said, using her fork to poke her food. "I see," he said, but he didn't completely see it all. He knew, without a doubt, that she must have stopped playing guitar because of him. "Who forced you to play it again?" he asked, curious. "Alvin, he made me play again." Her face glowed at the mere mention of the name Alvin, and Neil was instantly curious about the male who seemed to mean more to her than her fiancé. "Who is Alvin?" "He's one of the children at the orphanage, one of my favorites of them all, actually. He's blind, but he has the most beautiful silver eyes in the world. He plays the guitar despite his disability to see. When I first saw him sitting alone in a corner playing the saddest song in the world, I couldn't resist playing for him when he asked if I could play him a song. He reminds me of someone who's lost in the dark void of my memories. Sometimes, I feel like I had a different life before I knew who I was. It's like whenever I try to remember that life, something stops it from resurfacing in my head." Neil's expression blanked upon hearing that. He stared at her lost expression as if to search for the depth of them. 5 years ago, he'd known that something was wrong with her memories, and 5 years later he realized that something wasn't cured yet. "I was supposed to see Emma yesterday in Mirage Mesa, but now," she muttered softly as if she were talking to herself. "Who is Emma?" She jerked her head away from her plate and glanced at him as if just realizing he was sitting in front of her. She wrinkled her small nose innocently that it made Neil feel the urge to kiss her plump mouth. "Emma is my therapist," she said. "She has been helping me with the weird feeling I've been having. And she has also been helping Alvin to cope with his disability to see." She began to tell him about the boy while keeping anything about her own condition away from it. A few minutes later, she felt a little embarrassed by her emotional enthusiasm, and lapsed into silence again, concentrating on her meal. When he was finished eating, Neil settled back against the sofa and propped his ankle on the opposite knee, watching the flames leaping and dancing in the fireplace, as he gave his dinner companion a chance to finish her meal without further interruptions from him. Perhaps it was the fact that he'd been locked in prison where there was no one to entertain him, or perhaps it was the fact that being with Mia Harrison again made him feel like he'd missed a great deal from life experience, thus he'd wanted to hear her keep talking about her experiences. He tried to concentrate on the next stage of his journey and his plan to go after the mastermind behind Da Kroll, but in his state of sated relaxation in his mountain house, he was more inclined to dwell on the amazing quirk of fate that had caused Mia Harrison to be sitting across from him. Throughout all the long weeks of working out every detail of his escape, throughout the endless nights he'd lain in his cell, dreaming of his first night in this house, not once had he ever imagined that he'd be here with Mia. For 1,000 reasons, it would have been far better if he were alone, but now that she was here, he couldn't just lock her up in a room, bring her food, and pretend she wasn't. After the last hour in her company, however, he was sorely tempted to do exactly that, because she was forcing him to recognize and reflect on all the things he had missed in his life and the things that were going to be lacking in it for all time. At the end of the week, he would be on the run again, and where he was going, there'd be no luxurious mountain cabins with cozy fires. There would be no more pleasant conversations about children in the orphanage with a lovely journalist who happened to have eyes like an angel and a smile that could melt stone. He couldn't remember ever seeing a woman's entire face light up the way hers had when she talked about those children. He'd seen rich heiresses, who would throw themselves at him, light up at the possibility of getting a set of jewelry from him. He'd seen the world's finest heiresses beg for his attention and his touch, which would annoy him to no end and make him view all women as clingy bitches. But until tonight, he had never, ever witnessed nor felt the real pleasure of wanting a woman to keep talking and smiling at him. When he was 18 years old, being beaten in the camp by his own uncle for the slightest mistake, and almost strangling on tears he refused to shed, he'd vowed never, ever to look back, to wonder how his life might have been if he hadn't agreed to join the military at the age of 12, if he had just taken his late father's legacy and continued to run the Galvera enterprises. Yet, now, at the age of 32, almost 33, when he was hardened beyond repair by the things he'd done and then and seen, he looked at Mia Harrison and succumbed to the temptation to wonder what his life would have been like if he wasn't blinded with his revenge against his parents' killer. As he lifted the wine glass to his lips, he watched the fireplace and watched a log crack in a shower of sparks and wondered what would have happened if his 12-year-old self had seen the little Mia when he went to search for her after his parents' death. Would she have been able to save him from himself then, to teach him to forgive, to soften his heart, to fill up the empty spaces in his life? Would she have been able to give him goals greater and more rewarding than his taste for cold revenge? Would she have been able to stop him when he was losing his mind as a teenager and killing without awareness when angered? With someone like Mia in his bed, would he have experienced something better, deeper, more profound, more lasting, than the mindless pleasure of an orgasm? Lastly, the clear unlikelihood of his thoughts hit him, and he marveled at his own foolishness. Where in the hell would he have ever thought of settling down? Until he was sentenced to prison, he'd taken his life like nothing. He'd wasted money on buying new, unnecessary things because he was too spoiled to wash anything. As a boy, he had been surrounded by servants and people, whose very presence were daily reminders of his social superiority. Though he had grown in camp, he still held on to the thought that he was more superior than anyone. He still believed he had control over anyone and could destroy anybody. His pride and ego were always hanging on his sleeves. He'd tossed his past away until he met Mia Harrison in Ivy Grove, and then, he had only taken her as a fleeting amusement. But now he was starting to wonder what it would be like if she had been in his life right from their childhood until now. If she were there, would he have had memorable moments in life, where he would have fun and enjoy the fun in life without having to connect everything to his mission? No, he wouldn't have changed his ways even though she had stayed with him, and he was damned sure he would have ruined her life and even killed her from one of his temper outbursts or destroyed that beautiful smile of hers. He was a monster, a devil, someone as angelic as Mia Harrison should stay clear of. But here he was, sitting in the same room with her. Neil rolled his glass between his hands as he contemplated all of his shattered thoughts, trying to be brutally honest with himself. After several moments, he decided that if Mia had been with him throughout all those years, he wouldn't have done anything to hurt her. He would have cherished her and done his damned best to keep her beautiful smile. However, now that he had come to this point where he was slowly losing his sanity, he would never, ever try to think of what a life would be with her. If she wouldn't be interfering with any of his plans, he would have ushered her straight out of his life and told her to go home and marry her fiancé, have his children, and live a life with meaning. Because, even at his most calloused, most jaded moments of his life, Neil would never have wanted to see anything that was as fine and unspoiled as Mia Harrison become handled and used and corrupted by him or his enemies who would gladly use her to get to him. But what if she had insisted on staying with him anyway, despite his advice? Would he have then taken her as his wife and taken her to his bed and had children with her, if and when she seemed to be willing? No. Would he have wanted to have children with her? No. Would he have even wanted to keep her around and allow himself to love and cherish her? Damn. No. Why not? Neil already knew exactly why not, but he glanced over at her anyway as if to confirm what he felt. She was sitting with her feet curled beneath her on the sofa, the firelight gleaming on her shiny hair as she looked up at a beautiful landscape portrait hanging above the fireplace. Her entire profile was as serene and as innocent as a little girl. And that was why he wanted to avoid her before he went to prison and why he didn't really want to be around her now. She deserves better than him. He was a man who'd sworn to never give his heart to any woman, to never have children. But she seemed to be a complete opposite of him. Although he was only 6 years older than she in actual years, he was centuries older than she in experience, and most of that experience had not been the sort she would admire or even approve of. And that was true even before he went to prison. Besides her youthful idealism, Neil felt terribly old and jaded. The fact that he found her incredibly sexy and desirable right now, even engulfed in that shapeless, bulky sweater of his, and the fact that he had an erection at this very moment only made him feel like a dirty, old, disgusting lech. On the other hand, she'd also made him smile tonight, and he appreciated that, he decided as he gulped down a swallow of wine. Chapter 134 Unexpected Report. Neil was so lost in his thoughts that he jumped slightly when Mia spoke with a hesitant smile. "You don't look like you're enjoying your evening very much." "I was thinking about watching the news on TV," he said vaguely. Mia, who had been uneasily aware of his frowning silence, leapt at the opportunity to occupy herself with something other than wondering if he was truly innocent of murdering her mother, and if he was going to try to kiss her again before the evening was over. Though she had appeared like she was eating the whole time, her mind had been going back to the feel of his lips against hers. "That's a good idea," she said, getting up quickly and reaching for her plate on the table. "Why don't you watch the news, and I'll wash off the dishes?" He glanced up at her with a frown as he replied, "So you can accuse me of breaking our deal?" "No way. I'll clear and wash the dishes." Mia watched in astonishment as he stood up and gathered up the plates and flatware, then headed for the kitchen in long strides. For a moment, she could hardly believe this man was the same man who, in the past, would dispose of plates instead of washing them. Though they had agreed that he'd do the cooking and washing, she hadn't thought he meant it, but He was actually doing it. For the whole time when they were talking over dinner, and when she wasn't answering his questions, doubts about his guilt had continued to plague her. She remembered the furious way he'd spoken about his subordinate, who did nothing to stand for him in court. She remembered the terrible despair in his voice when he'd pleaded with her in the snow to kiss him in order to mislead the truck driver. "Please, I didn't kill anyone. I swear to everything and anything that's holy." At that moment, he had planted a seed of doubt in her mind about his guilt. Now, 18 hours later, that seed was taking root deep within her, nourished by her horror at the possibility that an innocent man had spent 5 long years in a prison where he'd been fed pills and treatment for insane people. And that alone would make him insane if he turned out to be innocent. And now, other things that were equally beyond her control were combining to make her feel helplessly drawn to him. Things like the memory of his hungry kiss, the shudder that had run through his body when she finally yielded, the restraint he showed when she did yield. In fact, he had treated her with restraint and even courtesy during most of the time they'd been together. Apart from forcing her to drive him here, he hadn't forced himself on her. For the dozenth time in the last hour, she decided a true murderer surely wouldn't bother to be gentle when he kissed a woman, nor would he treat her with the kindness and humor that Neil had generally shown her. Her mind argued that she was being a fool to decide that a whole bunch of investigating teams and judges were wrong. But tonight, whenever she looked at him, every instinct she possessed shouted that he was innocent. And if he was, then she could hardly bear the thought of what he had been put through in that prison. Neil walked back into the living room after washing the dishes, turned on the flat-screen television, and sat down across from her, stretching his long legs out and crossing them at the ankles. "We'll watch whatever you like after the news," he said, his attention already on the television's huge screen. "All right," Mia nodded her head, secretly studying him from across the length of the coffee table. There was a clear pride chiseled into his handsome face, determination in the jut of his chin, arrogance in his jaw, intelligence and hard-bitten strength etched into every feature of his face. In the past, when she didn't know who Neil Wayner was, and also had no idea the man she called Mr. Ice Cube was the infamous Neil Wayner, she'd read and done dozens of research about him written by gushing reporters. Often, they tried to define him as a man with the brain of a machine. They praised him for the lives he had saved in the country. But after what happened years ago, his name alone had become something every young lady, who'd gush at the mere mention of his name before, frowned upon. Now, after spending almost 2 days with Neil Wayner himself, Mia decided that none of the articles she'd read had actually done him justice, and she vaguely understood why. The real Neil, who's not under any disguise, had an aloof strength, a powerful charisma about him that had nothing whatsoever to do with his tall, broad-shouldered physique or that heartwarming, mocking smile of his. There was something else. A feeling Mia got whenever she looked at him that, without his imprisonment, Neil Wayner had already done and experienced things in life that all those experiences were permanently locked away behind the walls of his lazy charm and piercing silver eyes. Beyond any woman's reach. And behind those walls lay the real him, Mia thought. Despite everything he'd done to her in the last 2 days, Neil made her want to get past those walls he'd put up in his heart. To discover what was underneath, to soften it, to find the boy he must have been, to make the man he had become laugh genuinely and grow tender with love. Mia gave herself a stern shake so she would step out of her delusional mind. None of that mattered. All that mattered was whether he was guilty of the crime or innocent. She stole another look at his profile and felt her heart turn over. An unexplainable tenderness surged through her as she suddenly had the urge to lay her hand on his stubborn jaw and soften them. He was innocent. She knew it. She could feel it. And the thought of all his male beauty and intelligence being caged up for 5 long years made her throat clench with emotions. A vision of a prison cell block flashed through her mind, the sound of cell doors clanging shut, of prison guards shouting, of men working restlessly in the prison yards, deprived of all their freedom and privacy. All their dignity and... The familiar reporter's voice on the television snapped Mia's wandering attention to the television screen, where she saw that the woman reporting the news today was none other than Sally Benton, who had made Mia's life miserable in the university after Diane Foster's death. Not in the mood to hear anything the woman was reporting, Mia stood up. "I'm going to get a glass of water," she told Neil, already heading for the kitchen, but something Sally said stopped her in her tracks. Days ago, Neil Wayner, who was once regarded as one of the most intelligent soldiers in our country, escaped from prison in Novaria, where he was serving a 55-year prison sentence for killing 3 innocent souls and bombing them all years ago. Mia swung around in time to see a picture of Neil wearing a prison uniform with numbers across his chest filling up the screen, and she walked into the living room as if mesmerized by the ugliness of what she saw and heard and felt while Sally continued. Neil Weiner is believed to be traveling with a woman, who everyone knows as a presenter in the movie industry. Here is a picture of her. A gasp escaped Mia's mouth as her own picture, which was taken last year with 2 other celebrities, flashed on the screen. She was wearing a red dress that had been too tight for her to breathe then. Authorities reported that Mia Harrison was last seen in Novaria days ago, where a man fitting Neil Weiner's description was seen getting into a red BMW 7 with her. At first, authorities believed that Ms. Harrison had been taken as a hostage against her will. At first? Mia burst out, looking at Neil, who was slowly standing up. What does she mean, at first? She asked, confused. She was taken against her will, so what was this woman saying? The answer to her question was immediate and horrifying as Sally said. The hostage theory was exploded late this afternoon when a truck driver reported that he saw a couple matching Weiner's and Harrison's descriptions at a rest stop near dawn this morning. The truck driver's cheerful face filled the screen next, only it was on videotape, and what he was saying made Mia feel sick with anger and shame. The 2 of them were having a snowball fight like kids. Then the woman, who I'm sure heck, was Mia Harrison. Anyway, she tripped and fell, and Weiner landed on top of her and pinned her wrist above her head with him smiling down at her face, and the next thing I knew they was necking and kissing. If she's a hostage, she sure wasn't acting like one, because I could swear on the holy book she looked to be enjoying whatever he was doing to her. Oh my God, Mia said, wrapping her arms around her stomach, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. In just a few moments, the ugly reality of her situation had destroyed the falsely cozy atmosphere of the mountain cabin, and she turned on the man who had taken her there, and to her own horror, she didn't see him as the innocent man she'd thought he was earlier but as he'd been on the television and what he truly was. He was a convict wearing a prison uniform with numbers across his chest. Before she could react, another more tormenting scene lit up the screen and Sally continued to say, "We have come to the conclusion that Ms. Harrison has been in contact with Weiner for the past 5 years. It didn't come as a surprise to many, as we all know she was the reason he'd committed the crimes years ago. Their love story hadn't ended in the university, and now, she has gone all out to help him escape." Mia watched in disbelief as random people who claimed to know her were being videotaped and being reported on the news. To make matters worse, the video that had been recorded 5 years ago in Ivy Grove's live event, where she was kissing Neil Weiner in the dressing room, was being played on the screen. Sally then continued to say, "Our reporter is in Mirage Mesa, where Ms. Harrison's fiancé lives. He was able to get a brief interview with Mr. Owen Sullivan and her best friend, Rain Wallace." A tear of shame rolled down her eyes as Owen's haggard, handsome face seemed like he was looking back at her on the screen as he said, "If my Mia is with Weiner, then she's with him against her will. That truck driver must be mistaken about who he saw or what he saw happening. And one more thing, Neil Weiner, if you are watching this, know that I will hunt you down if you don't release my woman." He finished with a stern, disapproving look at the reporters who started throwing questions at him. "Is it true that Mia Harrison was once a whore in the town you grew up in? We heard that she climbed up the social ladder by giving herself to countless men in the industry. We also heard that you were just marrying her to save her reputation. Can you tell us more about her?" Owen's glare was palpable as he replied to the reporters through clenched teeth, "I am marrying Mia Harrison because I love her. She had never been a whore. Now if you please excuse me, I have my fiancé to worry about." Chapter 135 Kiss Me Back. With shame streaking through her in sick waves, Mia snapped her face from the screen and stared at Neil through a blur of hot tears as he began to walk swiftly toward her. "You bastard!" she cried, backing away as he neared her. "Mia," Neil said, reaching for her shoulders in a helpless attempt to comfort her. "Don't touch me," she cried, trying to fling his hands away from her shoulders, writhing and slamming her fists against his chest while a rush of sobs erupted from her throat. "Do you have any idea how much I suffered for the past 5 years because of you?" she wept. "I worked myself out just so I could step out of the shadows of the terrible reputation you got me in. I used my sweat to become who I am today. I was respected by many women, but now you've made me into a public slut." She cried hysterically. "Little girls looked up to me and wanted to be like me. Do you think they'll let me show my face again on screen or go close to any children now that I'm a national scandal who made out in the snow with an escaped murderer who they also claimed is my lover? The realization that she was probably right slashed through Neil like a jagged razor, and he tightened his grip on her arms. Mia, listen, I've spent the last 5 years of my life, she sobbed brokenly, struggling harder against his grasp, trying to be good for my mom. I was doing so good. She wept, and the sound of her pain transmitted itself into Neil even though he didn't fully understand its source. And now, you've ruined everything for me. As if she'd finally exhausted herself physically, she stopped struggling and her head fell forward, but her shoulders continued to shake with sobs. I tried so hard, she choked. I became a presenter so Mom would be proud. I go to charity events to be close to children who make me happy. They won't let me close to the children anymore after this. Mia recalled all the nights she'd spent drinking in the darkness of her room when the world turned its back on her years ago, when no one wanted to be close to her, all because of Neil Weiner. She would drink herself into insanity until she started to hallucinate. Back then, only by visiting the orphanage and being around the children would she finally find peace. She'd strived diligently to earn forgiveness from the world by going above and beyond, showcasing her efforts online. Yet, today, everything was breaking down once more, all due to her foolishness in trusting Neil Weiner again. I am ruined. Nobody will ever welcome me into society again. I was never wanted and I will never be. She cried, her voice choked with emotions. Suddenly Neil couldn't bear the weight of her sorrow or his own culpability anymore. Stop it, please, he whispered achingly, wrapping her in his arms, cupping his hand around her head and holding her face pressed to his chest. I understand. It's my fault and I'm sorry. When this is all over, I'll make them see the truth. You understand, she repeated with bitter scorn, lifting her tear-streaked, accusing face to his. How can someone like you understand how I feel? Someone like him, a monster like him, he thought as rage overruled his guilt. Oh, I understand, he bit out, holding her away from his chest, shaking her until she looked up at him. I understand exactly what it feels like to be despised for something you didn't do. I understand perfectly. Mia choked back her protest at his rough handling as she registered the fury on his face and the agony in his gray eyes. His fingers bit into her arms, and his voice was raw with emotion. I didn't kill anyone. Do you hear me? Lie to me and say you believe me. Just say it. I want to hear someone say it. Having just experienced herself a tiny part of what he would feel if he was truly innocent, Mia cringed inwardly at the thought of what he could be feeling. If he was truly innocent. She swallowed, her blurry eyes searching his haggard, handsome face, and she spoke her thoughts aloud. I believe you, she whispered, fresh tears starting to spill over her lashes and down her cheeks. I do. Neil heard the sincerity in her tearful voice. In her brown eyes he saw the dawning of true compassion, and deep within him the wall of ice he'd kept around his heart for years began to thaw and crack. Lifting his hand, he laid it against her soft cheek, his thumb helplessly rubbing away her hot tears. Don't cry for me, Mia more, he murmured, his voice hoarse. I believe you, she repeated more firmly, and the tender fierceness of her reply demolished what was left of his reserve. Neil's throat clenched around an unfamiliar knot of emotion, and for a moment he stood there, immobilized by what he saw and heard and felt. Her tears were streaming down her cheeks, clinging to her sooty lashes, wetting his hand, and she was biting down on her lower lip, trying to stop it from trembling. Please, don't cry, he whispered achingly as he lowered his mouth to hers to stop her lips from trembling. Please, please don't. At the first touch of his mouth, she went rigidly still, her breath indrawn, though Neil had no idea if it was fear or surprise that made her go still. He didn't know and didn't care at that moment. His only desire was to hold her, to savor the sweet feelings swelling inside him, the first sweetness he'd felt in years, to share it all with her. Telling himself to go slowly, to be content with whatever she was willing to permit, Neil slid his lips back and forth over the contours of hers, tasting the saltiness of her tears. He told himself not to push her, not to force her, and even while he did, he began to do both. Kiss me back, he urged, and the helpless tenderness he heard in his voice was as alien to him as the other feelings coursing through him. Kiss me back, he repeated, sliding his tongue over the seam of her lips. Open your mouth, he coaxed. When she obeyed and leaned into him, crushing her parted lips to his, Neil almost groaned aloud with the pleasure of it. Desire, raw and fresh, poured through his veins, and suddenly he was acting on pure instinct. His arm tightened, angling across her back, holding her hips pressed to his while his lips forced hers to part wider, and his tongue plunged into the wine-flavored softness of her mouth. He backed her against the wall, kissing her with all the persuasive force he could muster, his mouth slanting over hers, his tongue teasing and provoking, his hands slowly sliding down her spine and then up. His hand slowly slid under her sweater. Her soft, bare skin felt like liquid satin beneath his hands as he caressed her narrow waist, stroked her back, and spread his fingers over her midriff, and then he finally let himself seek her breasts. She pressed closer to him and moaned into his mouth when he touched her breasts, and the sweet sound was all he needed as approval. It made his entire body throb while his fingers explored every inch of her breast and nipple, his lips locked to hers, his tongue exploring with rampant hunger. To Mia, what he was doing to her was like being imprisoned in a cage of dangerous, terrifying sensuality where she had no control over anything, particularly herself. She knew in the back of her head that what she was doing was considered cheating on the man she was going to be marrying, who was now worried sick about her, but she couldn't bring herself to put a stop to the sweetness of what he was doing to her. Beneath the exploration of his long fingers, her breasts were beginning to ache with need. Against her will, her heated body was molding itself to the hardened contours of his, and her parted lips were welcoming the continued invasion of his tongue. Neil felt her fingers sliding into the soft hairs at his nape, and he dragged his mouth across her cheek to her ear. "Damn it, you are so sweet, Carita," he whispered while he took her nipples between his fingers, forcing them to harden into tight, hard buds, wanting to lavish her with pleasure. "Little one," he murmured hoarsely, "I want you, I need you so badly." "You are beautiful," he whispered against her mouth with his hands pulling up her sweater. It might have been the way he'd addressed her, or perhaps it was his ridiculous use of the word beautiful that finally broke the sensual spell she was under, but Mia slowly realized that what they were doing was entirely wrong and that she would be a real slut if she didn't put an end to it. She felt his hand gently squeeze at her breast and she heard herself moan into his kiss, but this time she mustered the strength to push at his chest. "Don't," she warned quickly, pulling free from his arms, pushing him away and yanking down her sweater. For a moment, Neil simply stood there, breathing deeply, arms at his sides, feeling completely abandoned. Mia's face was flushed with desire, and her glorious eyes were still glazed with it, but she looked as if she wanted to bolt for the door if he were to come any close to her again. Softly, as if speaking to a little child, he said, "What's wrong, Carita? Just stop it right now." She burst out, "I am not your darling. I do not want to hear you call me that. I don't want to hear that I am beautiful either." Neil gave his head a shake to clear his foggy mind. Suddenly, he realized that she was breathing in quick, shallow pants, watching him as if she half expected him to pounce on her, tear off her clothes, and rape her. He said very quietly and very carefully, "Are you afraid of me, Mia?"